Okay, we're on to part 3, which brings us another step closer to this week's lab, which is about creating density surfaces from point locations. So there are two basic methods for creating density surfaces, and you're going to get to do them both. You are going to get a spreadsheet with some coyote location coordinates. And one thing to know before you draw any conclusions from this data is that it's a very random subset of animal locations pulled from a much, much larger data set. I specifically selected animals whose home ranges didn't overlap to make this visualization easier. So I welcome you to explore the data and imagine the kinds of inferences that you could draw from it, but don't actually draw any conclusions from this data because it's kind of a mock-up. All right, so there are two common practices for calculating home ranges. The first is called minimum convex polygon, which constructs a polygon from joining the outermost points of the data set together. The polygon has one value, something like true. And so there's an assumption that the animal uses the whole area equally, which is a limitation. The MCP home range is commonly used, though, and has been for decades because it's such an easy calculation to make. And it's still widely in use today because of the large number of MCP home ranges that have been calculated in the past. So we kind of have to do this calculation to compare apples to apples. This is what your data will look like when you calculate MCP, or minimum convex polygons, from your data sets. So each one of these is a different animal. I just symbolized this coyote's point locations with its MCP polygon in the same color so it was easier to visualize. Hopefully you'll notice, though, that where the home ranges overlap, Arc does a very shabby job of displaying both polygons at the same time. So just be aware of that. Even though they're semi-transparent, you can't actually see the green home range underneath this bigger orange one. You can't see the orange through the purple. So there is a lot of overlap here anyway, but just something to be aware of. Okay, the other way of calculating a home range is called a kernel density estimate, or KDE. We're going to talk about how these are created specifically in a minute, but you can already hopefully see what a different beast this is. KDE outputs a raster instead of a vector, a polygon. The values of the raster can be thought of as a probability. So it's a continuous surface, and then we can classify this continuous range of probabilities to estimate home range areas. The 50% and 95% probability of use areas are the most commonly employed. The 50% KDE home range represents the core area that the animal uses most intensively, and the 95% kernel home range is a more general representation of what the animal needs to survive. It's typically called an edge home range. So we have a core and an edge, and it's a 50 and 95% probability of use area. That's basically just a classification of this probability density output. So similar to the minimum convex polygon, the KDE assumes use of the whole area, but it can extrapolate beyond the location of the outside points, which you can see here, which is reasonable. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about the specifics of kernels. So your results may end up looking something like this, which is quite different from the MCP. It does result in these things which you could construe as outliers, but gets at a core and an edge home range for each animal, and helps us understand, more about use of the landscape, I think. Okay, so how do we do this? Let's get into the specifics. Here are some points. Think of these as locations of an animal. But the question is, how certain are we that the animal was really occupying this exact point location? We have GPS error, so we have some uncertainty already about the actual location of this point representing the actual occupation of this place with an animal. And then we have another question. How certain are we that the animal was really occupying this location as an integral part of its territory and not just passing through or being chased by kids? The animal might really have been here, or here, or here. But we want to place the highest probability that the animal was closest to its recorded location. So that would make sense. So what we're going to do is replace each one of these points with a probability function that the animal was probably closest to here, but could have been anywhere in a range around this point. So we're going to employ a probability function, and we're going to replace each one of these points with something called a kernel. This is a kernel. A kernel is basically a three-dimensional shape, like a pile of sand. It's a three-dimensional probability density function for those of you who are familiar with PDFs. So each point location is going to be replaced with one of these, and we're basically saying that it's most probable that the true location is at the center and at the peak of this shape. But there's a probability that the true location is somewhere in this shape. As we get out to the edges, we approach the probability being 0, if that makes sense. So this kernel is defined by two things: the shape of it and the radius of it. The radius of the width, basically, and at what point the probability goes to 0. When the point is a location, before I move on, the pile heights are all going to be the same. But if there's an attribute, an attribute associated with the location, like number of reactors at a nuclear facility, then the height can reflect that attribute value. But the total area under the kernel shape equals the attribute value of the location, if there is one. So this height isn't equal to the attribute value. It's the area under the shape that equals the attribute value, and that isn't necessarily important. It's just kind of an interesting little tidbit of information for you Cliff Clavens out there. Okay, so this shape is user defined, and this is basically a nice little demonstration of the different shapes you can choose. Gaussian is the most common. That's this bell-shaped curve. Cosine has a sharper edge to it. Quartic, it doesn't really matter. It turns out that the shape of the kernel doesn't influence the results nearly as much as the width of it, the bandwidth of it. So that's something to keep in mind. Where you do want to pay attention to this is if you have very discontinuous or discrete entities that you're mapping, then you'd want to stick with a uniform distribution where it's kind of a true-false in or out of this shape, and a less gradual probability function. That's just something to be aware of, that if you do need to control for discontinuity, you'd want to consider that. Okay, so sometimes the locations are near to each other, and so these piles of sand, quote unquote, overlap. The resulting density surface is calculated from the cumulative heights of these piles of sand at every location on the surface. So I'm going to show another example of this in a second, but if these are our observations, and each one of these pink dashed lines is our kernel that we're placing over each one of these shapes, we're going to add the cumulative area under each one of the kernels to get this resulting kernel estimate. This is our density surface that we're creating right here. It is, like I said, very important to know that the kernel estimate is more heavily influenced by this bandwidth than the shape of the kernel. So I wouldn't get as hung up on the shape. The bandwidth is kind of the limiting factor. It's the radius, or the distance from the peak beyond which the kernel value or the probability goes to 0, that the observed location is going to be beyond this thing. And there are many, many ways of estimating, millions of algorithms for estimating this bandwidth. And it's something that you need to mess around with. It's something that you need to look to the literature for your specific animal, for the distribution of your points, etc., etc. And we're going to talk about it when we run our tools a little bit. But I just want to show a couple of examples. The effects of the bandwidth can be seen here. I took this off Wikipedia, so I welcome you to just Google how does KDE work. You'll find really great tutorials online. So the blue dashes down along the x-axis here are the observations. They're basically 100 random sample points from a normal distribution. The gray curved line is what we would call the true density surface created from these. It's a bell curve, right? The red curve is what we would call an underestimation of the bandwidth. It's a bandwidth which is too small, and it results in this peaky or flashy density estimate surface. The green is has a bandwidth, which we call H, that's too large. And it results in over smoothing the results, the observed density here. The black line is what we would call a best fit. So how would you come up with this? Well, there are calculations that you can do. The software that we're going to use to run KDE has a plugin where it calculates the most appropriate bandwidth for us, and that's why we're going to get out of ArcGIS for a minute. But I just want to talk about bandwidth a little bit more. So I did go into ArcGIS and experimented with bandwidth a little bit. They do have a kernel density tool, and I just want you to notice the edges here. So this is the default setting. They do have kind of a default estimator for the bandwidth, and it looks pretty good relative to what you're going to see. Then I set different search radiuses, which is what Arc calls it, but it's the same thing as a bandwidth. The kernel, basically the width of it. This is a 100 meter radius, 500 meter, which looks, I think, pretty decent as well, which gives us an idea of what they've used for their default. 750 is an over smoothing, and then a 1,000 meter way over smoothed. You know, does it depend on what you want? Yes, it's going to depend on you and your research. Let's see here. The units here are a little tough to understand, but they're basically magnitude per unit area. The area units are set by the user. And there are a couple things that the ARC tool does have going for it, by the way. Number one, you can include a population field, so we can pull a value, an attribute value, and you know, set a height for these things that is different from just true false. And it also has the ability to use geodesic distances so that we can cover up bonky projections or deal with really large extent data sets, which is kind of nice. Okay, so you might then ask, well then why don't we just stick with ArcMap? Why are you going to make us go and download this whole other suite of tools? Well, because Arc, as we know, is limited, and there are people who have done it better out there, and GME is a better, has a way better kernel density estimator than the one that we can find in Arc. But I do welcome you to experiment with this and compare the results. It takes 2 seconds to run this. Even if you change the search radius a little bit, you're going to invest all of 5 minutes, and it's kind of interesting to see the difference, I think. The two of the main limitations are, number one, there's no way to choose the kernel shape. The kernel is, as far as I can tell, Gaussian, and the bandwidth is optional, and you can employ your own, but it doesn't have ways to estimate your own. You'd have to do the calculation or estimating for the bandwidth outside of Arc, and if you let it just do its default thing, it's going to use kind of a normal distribution approximation, which may not suit your data distribution. So we are going to get out of Arc for this exercise and use a KDE tool found in the Geospatial modeling environment. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's the suite of tools formerly known as Hoth's tools. It's really a scripting kind of environment, and I think you'll enjoy getting out of the slick GUI user interface that's in Arc and playing with a little bit of scripting. Don't freak out about it. I don't expect you to be a scriptwriter or a modeler, but the instructions here are pretty straightforward, and this will give you a really, I hope, give you a really good look at what's possible when we start getting into Python and some of the scripting environments. It's pretty powerful stuff. So a couple of caveats. You need to be careful when you install this GME. It does communicate with R. The library that we need that has the plugin that estimates our bandwidth needs to communicate with R for the statistics, and so they have to be installed in the right order. So absolutely follow the directions on the GME website or reference the lab instructions, because I walk through the install pretty specifically. You will need to get that to work though. You need this KS library, because when you set the bandwidth, you want to have this plugin available here. So you'll just read the instructions. It should be pretty straightforward. And then one final note of caution. Remember to keep the uncertainty of your results in check. The density surfaces are a probability, and these probabilities are influenced by a lot of things, like the characteristics of the animals, external forces, seasonality. So remain ever vigilant, cautious, and suspicious of your results within reason. I mean, don't be paranoid, but you know, just keep that in mind all the time. Sometimes without being aware of mistakes that can happen. It's hard to know, like the unknown unknowns that we talked about in the fifth little chunk of uncertainty, but by now you should have a pretty healthy awareness of the unknowns, and just keep these things in mind. And that's it. I'm going to come back for part 4 and quickly discuss use versus availability. We're almost there.